Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the Appalachian Mountains. Before we step inside, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now, and what time of day or night? Is it where you are? Leave a comment. Some of the strangest occurrences in these stories seem to reach different people at different times. And maybe you'll feel it too as we go forward. Nobody dared enter this cabin in 1899, and those who tried never returned the same. What exactly lurked inside, hidden for over a century, waiting for the next visitor? Tonight, you'll follow me as I uncover its secrets. They told me the cabin was abandoned, forgotten by time, sitting deep in the Appalachian Mountains since 1899. Locals whispered of people who had crossed its threshold and returned, changed, faces pale, eyes wide, voices trembling when they spoke of what they had seen. Some never spoke at all. The forest around it is quiet, too quiet, as if the trees themselves are holding their breath. I wanted to know why. I wanted to see for myself. And yet, as I stepped closer to its shadowed outline, a question pressed against my mind so loudly I could almost hear it in the still air. What exactly had made this place impossible to enter safely, even for those who dared over 100 years ago? The path leading to the cabin wound between ancient trees, their trunks gnarled and scarred by decades of storms and frost. Moss clung to every surface, thick and wet, leaving the air fragrant with earthy decay. My boots sank into damp soil with every step, and the faint scent of wet leaves and rotting wood filled my nostrils. A thin mist hovered between the trunks, curling in delicate tendrils, drifting across the underbrush in a ghostly ballet. Somewhere above, a raven called, its cry sharp and unsettling in the otherwise still forest. The branches overhead scratched and tapped, brushing against each other, producing a sound that mimicked the quiet steps of someone, or something, following behind me. And then, as I paused to catch my breath, I noticed the way the air itself seemed heavier here, thicker, pressing against my chest with a weight I could not explain. The forest was alive with absence. Hours, or perhaps minutes, felt like the same in the dense shade. The trail narrowed, and the trees seemed to close in, their twisted limbs forming shapes that I could not quite identify, yet shapes that my mind insisted were watching me. Shadows pooled in corners and hollows, sometimes resembling figures crouched just beyond the fog. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the mist, bouncing across fallen logs, revealing the glint of wet leaves, the hollow eyes of empty tree knots, and the skeletal remains of underbrush crushed under unseen steps. The air smelled of damp bark, old smoke, and something faintly metallic. I breathed carefully, trying not to make a sound, yet my heart pounded in rhythm with every small snapping twig beneath my feet. And then I saw it, the cabin. Its outline emerged from the fog like a memory, dark and silent, the roof sagging, windows cracked, its door hanging slightly open as if inviting me in, yet threatening everything I had ever believed about safety. Stepping closer, I noticed details I could not have expected from a building abandoned for so long. The wood, though rotting, retained the warmth of its original craftsmanship. The nails protruded at odd angles, each one rusted yet stubbornly clinging to their purpose. The hinges groaned as the door shifted gently in the breeze, producing a sound like a sigh, or perhaps a warning. My hand hovered over the handle, hesitant, trembling. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, and yet the pull of curiosity, the same force that had brought countless others to their undoing, was stronger than any fear I felt. I pushed the door open, and it swung slowly, deliberately, almost as if the cabin had waited for me all these years to arrive. The interior was cold, darker than the surrounding forest at night. Dust motes floated in the flashlight's beam, disturbed by my entrance, each one catching the light like tiny, hovering specters. Broken furniture littered the room, chairs tipped over, a table cracked and worn, remnants of books scattered across the floor. A fireplace, blackened with years of disuse, stood like a monument in one corner, the remnants of ash long settled, yet faintly smelling of smoke that was not quite extinguished. The air carried the faintest hint of rot, of aged wood and damp earth, and with it, a feeling that I was not alone. Footsteps seemed to echo behind me, though none existed. Something shifted just beyond my flashlight's reach, a movement so subtle it might have been the settling of the cabin itself. Yet it drew my gaze, forcing me to scan every shadowed corner. As I moved through the cabin, the floorboards creaked under my weight, and I caught glimpses of scratches along the walls, symbols, letters, or marks left by hands long gone. The air pressed in on me, cold and damp, and every sound, the drip of water from the leaky roof, the skitter of an unseen creature in the corner, the groan of the old door swinging back and forth, seemed amplified. I whispered to myself, repeating the names of those who had come before me, the mountain men of 1899, whose accounts had survived in fragmented journals and oral histories. Each story told of a man, or sometimes a woman, drawn to the cabin, compelled to explore, only to return changed, wary, pale, haunted. Some disappeared entirely, leaving behind nothing but echoes in the valley, and the lingering memory of doors left slightly ajar, of windows left cracked, of chairs overturned without explanation. And then, faintly, I heard it. A dragging sound from the far corner of the cabin. Not a footstep, not something light, but a deliberate scraping across the floor, growing slowly louder. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight beam toward the sound, but the room appeared empty, each shadow still and inert. I took a cautious step forward, and the sound ceased abruptly, leaving a silence heavier than the one outside. My breathing became loud, echoing in my ears, yet I forced myself to continue, drawn toward a chest in the corner, its surface coated in decades of dust. Brushing the dust aside revealed scratches, letters half-formed, messages that no one could decipher. I could feel the weight of the cabin pressing down on me, as though the walls themselves remembered everything that had transpired within them, and were unwilling to let me leave unmarked. Hours passed, minutes lost all meaning, as I explored the cabin, discovering evidence of those long gone. A broken chair that appeared moved since the last visitor, the faint imprint of a shoe in dust that had settled a century ago, and the faint smell of smoke lingering in corners where fire had not burned in decades. I read fragments of journals, torn and yellowed, describing noises in the night, figures glimpsed from the corner of the eye, doors that opened and closed of their own accord. One entry, barely legible, spoke of a shadow that had followed him into the forest, silent, patient, waiting for the mind to falter. It was as if the cabin itself recorded every encounter, every sound, every breath, waiting for someone new to become part of its story. By now, my flashlight seemed inadequate. Shadows pooled unnaturally, creeping along the walls with a life of their own. A coldness pressed at my shoulders, and the sense of being watched grew unbearable. I paused at a corner, listening. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, yet within the cabin, a deeper sound persisted. A scraping, a sigh, a subtle rhythm I could not place. My heartbeat thudded, each pulse echoing in the empty space. I whispered aloud, calling the name of a friend who was not there, hoping for a response. Silence answered me, yet the pressure remained, palpable in the nerves of my arms, the ache in my chest, the tremble in my hands. Something existed here, not in form, but in memory, in essence, in presence, as real as the floorboards beneath me and the walls enclosing me. The dragging sound had ceased, yet the sense of presence lingered. I could feel it in the air, in the weight pressing against my shoulders, in the shadows that seemed to twitch ever so slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. I stepped toward the far corner, flashlight beam sweeping over the cracked floorboards and broken furniture, and noticed a small journal wedged beneath a fallen chair. Its cover was brittle, pages yellowed and curling, but the ink inside had held remarkably well. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, as if the author had been afraid while recording his thoughts. I flipped it open, my breath catching with each line. The first entries were mundane, notes about the surrounding forest, about hunting, about food stores, but soon the tone shifted. The writer spoke of sounds at night, of whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "I hear them moving," one passage read, "always at the edge of my vision, waiting. I cannot sleep, I cannot think. If they touch me, I will not be the same." The words sent a chill down my spine. I looked around the cabin, suddenly aware that every shadow could be more than it seemed. My flashlight flickered, and I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the beam. But when I turned fully, nothing remained. The journal continued, describing attempts to leave the cabin, each interrupted by strange occurrences. Doors slamming shut on their own, footsteps echoing in empty rooms, objects rearranged without explanation. One entry described a sound, a scraping along the floorboards, like claws moving deliberately, growing closer with every attempt to sleep. Another spoke of a figure that appeared in the window at dawn, silent and still, observing with intent that was impossible to describe. The author concluded one page with the words, "It remembers. Everything is remembered." The implication was clear. The cabin was not simply a building, it was a presence, patient and watchful, recording every visitor, every sound, every thought. I moved slowly through the room, careful not to disturb anything, yet everything seemed to react to my presence. Floorboards groaned under my weight in ways that were almost deliberate. The chair I had brushed against earlier rattled as if pushed by an unseen hand. My breath came faster, shallow, yet I forced myself onward. I approached a corner where the walls were covered in scratches, symbols half-formed, letters that could have been a language lost to time. I traced them lightly with a finger, feeling the grooves cut into the wood, and a chill ran along my spine. The journal had warned of these marks. They were left by others who had attempted to understand, to record, to make sense of what lived in this space. And now, I was part of it. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, not the cold of the mountains, but a deeper, sharper cold, pressing into my bones. I exhaled slowly, the air visible in front of me, curling like mist in a cave. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to leave the cabin, to abandon my curiosity entirely. But the pull was irresistible. I had come this far. The answers, or whatever truth lingered, would not remain hidden because I refused to look. My flashlight beam wavered, and the shadows deepened. A scraping sound resumed, soft at first, then deliberate, moving closer, echoing along the floorboards with an intelligence I could not place. I froze. It was not the wind. It was deliberate, and I knew it was aware of me. I backed toward the doorway, heart hammering, eyes scanning every dark corner. The air felt thicker, heavier, almost alive. Then I saw it. A figure, partially hidden behind the broken frame of a doorway, just tall enough to be human-shaped. Yet something was off. The head tilted in an unnatural way, the outline blurred as if the shadows themselves bent around it. I gasped, and the figure vanished in an instant, leaving only the oppressive silence and the faint echo of that dragging sound retreating into the corners of the cabin. My mind tried to rationalize what I had seen. Light trick, imagination, exhaustion. But every fiber of my being told me that what I had glimpsed was real and patient, waiting. The journal suggested that these experiences were cumulative. Each visitor left a mark. Each presence amplified the cabin's memory. I walked to the center of the room, careful to step lightly, aware that my every movement might be recorded in this strange, preserved space. The air felt thick, almost viscous, and I realized that the cabin's floorboards were cold far beyond what any natural explanation would allow. My flashlight illuminated a corner where shadows pooled unnaturally, moving almost imperceptibly as I approached. I could see scratches along the floor there, deep grooves that were too deliberate to have occurred naturally. It was as if something, or someone, had been dragging objects, leaving traces for me to see, to follow, to fear. Hours passed, though time lost meaning inside the cabin. I explored rooms whose existence I had not noticed from the doorway. Small closets, a loft accessed by a precarious ladder, cupboards with remnants of objects long decayed. Each discovery carried with it a sense of history, a trace of human habitation mixed with something else, something patient and observant. One room contained a small cot, moldy and torn, with stains that were impossible to identify. Another revealed a cupboard filled with jars, each containing an unidentifiable substance, labeled in handwriting that matched the journal, but with cryptic symbols added at the edges. Each artifact felt as though it carried a story, a warning, a memory. And then I heard whispers. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, yet unmistakably words, murmured in a voice that seemed both distant and right beside me. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to hear. The whispering continued. Fragmented sentences I could not fully understand, but the intent was clear. Attention, observation, waiting. The dragging resumed, now accompanied by a faint thumping from above. I dared a glance upward toward the loft ladder, and saw nothing. Yet the sense of weight above me was undeniable, a presence unseen, yet tangible. My flashlight flickered, dimmed, then brightened again, revealing nothing, yet leaving an impression of movement, as if the cabin itself had shifted slightly, breathing. I found myself at the far wall of the cabin, facing a small window cracked open at the top. Moonlight spilled in, revealing the outline of trees beyond, and the mist rolling over the mountainside. Yet something was wrong. Shadows outside moved in ways that did not match the trees, dark shapes that vanished when I blinked or turned my gaze. My mind struggled to maintain logic, but the journal had warned of this. Visions that played tricks on the eyes, shapes that existed only to be glimpsed and feared. I leaned closer, heart hammering, compelled to look, to see, to understand. And then, a sudden sound, sharp and deliberate, a crash from the loft above, made me stumble backward, flashlight beam swinging wildly, illuminating nothing but shadows and dust. I realized then that the cabin was not static. Every sound, every step, every movement seemed to have a response. Objects shifted while I was not looking, Small details altered. A chair that had been on its side moments ago now leaned upright. A book I had not touched lay open on a different page. The dragging sound returned. Slower now, deliberate, pacing around me as though tracking my attention. And I understood fully. The cabin remembered. Every visitor, every action, every gaze left a mark. And I had become part of that memory, woven into its fabric. A participant in a story that had begun long before I arrived. Historical accounts corroborated much of this. Newspapers from the late 1800s spoke of local farmers and hunters who had wandered too close, reporting strange lights in the windows, unexplained noises, and a sense of being watched. One account described a man entering the cabin with tools to repair the structure. He returned days later, his hair white, eyes wide, unable to speak for hours. Another described a family who camped nearby, claiming to hear footsteps pacing in rhythm with their own, stopping when they stopped, moving when they moved, yet never leaving the cabin itself. Each story, though fragmented, painted a consistent picture. The cabin was a repository of attention, a space that observed and responded, and that left its mark on those who dared to enter. I traced the walls, fingertips brushing against scratches, grooves, symbols that were at once human and incomprehensible. The journal mentioned similar marks, created over decades, layered upon each other. They were a record, a warning, and perhaps a plea. I could feel the weight of all those who had come before me, pressing into the floorboards, into the air, into my awareness. The cabin was a memory made physical, a history that could not be ignored, and I was now part of it. I stepped carefully toward the center, flashlight beam cutting across the room, when I heard it again. A dragging, scraping, deliberate sound, moving in a pattern I could almost anticipate, yet could not fully understand. My pulse raced, but I could not tear my eyes away from the journal lying on the floor, its pages fluttering as if moved by some invisible wind, calling me forward, demanding I witness, that I participate. I approached the loft ladder slowly, each rung creaking beneath my weight. The beam of my flashlight trembled across the darkened rafters, revealing cobwebs thick with dust and scratches etched into the beams, almost as though someone, or something, had climbed here long before me. The air grew colder with each step, biting at my hands and face. I could feel a presence above me, patient, watching, waiting for me to lift my gaze. The dragging sound had returned, soft at first, then deliberate, circling around me in rhythm with my heartbeat. I froze, gripping the ladder tightly, eyes scanning the shadows, and the world seemed to contract into the sound of that noise and the trembling light cutting through darkness. At the top, the loft revealed a scene that made every nerve in my body tighten. Old trunks and crates lay scattered, their contents half spilled. Rusted tools, books with yellowed pages curling from decades of humidity, jars filled with unidentifiable substances. But the thing that drew my attention was a small cot in the corner. Torn, moldy, and sagging, it looked as though it had been recently used, though the cabin had been abandoned for over a century. My flashlight illuminated a faint footprint in the dust, smudged but undeniably present, leading from the cot to the loft entrance. I swallowed hard, the air thick and oppressive, realizing fully that the cabin's history, its memory, might not be confined to the past. It could still be alive. I knelt beside the cot, fingertips brushing the floor, brushing dust aside. There, faint scratches marred the wooden planks, tiny letters that formed words I could not decipher, but their intent was clear: attention, observation, warning. My heartbeat quickened, and a cold gust swept through the loft, making the pages of a nearby journal flutter violently. I looked up, flashlight trembling in hand, and caught movement in the shadows. A shape at the edge of the light, almost human, yet distorted. It vanished when I blinked, leaving the loft empty, yet the weight of its presence lingered. The dragging sound resumed, now deliberate, methodical, as though pacing around me, circling me, mapping me, recording me. I descended the ladder carefully, aware that every movement was scrutinized, catalogued, remembered. The cabin seemed to shift around me. Chairs that had been upright moments ago now lay overturned. A book I had seen open on one page now rested closed, pages pressed down, as if someone had read and replaced it. The floorboards groaned in rhythm with the dragging sound, sometimes matching my steps, sometimes offset, creating a dissonance that made my stomach churn. Shadows pooled unnaturally in corners, and though I saw nothing directly, I felt them brush against the edges of my vision. The cabin's presence was undeniable, yet impossible to define. I was inside a space that remembered, that adapted, that watched. I moved toward the fireplace, the largest open space in the cabin. Ash and soot coated the hearth, yet faint traces of recent smoke lingered, a smell subtle but distinct. I knelt, reaching into the ashes, and found fragments of paper, charred and fragile. They were scraps of journals, torn from the larger volumes I had seen earlier, filled with writing that chronicled the same experiences I was now living. Unexplained movements, whispers, shadows at the periphery of vision, objects rearranging themselves, and the dragging sound. The words seemed almost alive, vibrating with the panic and fear of those who had come before me. I realized then that I was following in their footsteps, experiencing the cabin's memory firsthand, as though it had been waiting for me to arrive and participate in its story. The journal fragments spoke of the hermit who had once lived here in 1899, a man whose name had been lost to time. He was described as a recluse, meticulous in his habits, yet obsessed with recording everything that happened within the cabin. Neighbors reported hearing him muttering to himself at odd hours, claiming the walls whispered back. One account spoke of him disappearing for days, only to return with eyes wide and hair disheveled, claiming to have seen things moving when no one else could. The cabin, it seemed, had always been a witness, a silent chronicler, and those who entered became part of its memory, and I was no exception. I wandered further into the cabin, flashlight cutting through darkness, illuminating broken furniture, overturned chairs, and shelves emptied of their contents. The air was heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves pressed in. Shadows shifted with the light, pooling where none should exist, forming shapes that were familiar and yet wrong. I could feel eyes upon me, not physical, but perceptive, aware. The dragging sound moved closer, deliberate, circling me now, echoing off walls in an unnatural rhythm. I took slow, cautious steps toward the main room, each creak of the floorboards announcing my presence. Yet the sound I followed did not belong to me. It was separate, distinct, purposeful. In one corner, I noticed a trapdoor, previously unnoticed. It was small, square, with hinges rusted through time, yet the outline was clear. The journal had mentioned hidden spaces, places the hermit had used to store objects, to observe, to record events without being seen. My curiosity overwhelmed my fear. I knelt, brushing the rusted latch free of dust, and lifted it slowly. Darkness yawned beneath, an absence of light so complete it seemed to pull the edges of the room inward. I shone the flashlight down and saw nothing but shadows, but the air coming up from the opening was thick, cold, alive. A faint smell of iron and decay drifted upward, and my stomach turned. Something had been here. Something had lingered in this hidden space for decades, waiting. I paused, listening. The dragging sound had stopped. Silence enveloped me, yet it was heavier than any normal absence of noise. My breath echoed in my own ears, the sound foreign in its intensity. Then, without warning, a small noise, a soft thump, came from below, the trapdoor rattling slightly. My pulse leapt. I shone the light down again, catching a shadow dart across the opening. I blinked, and it was gone. The journal had warned of shadows moving without cause, of presence without form. I realized with growing horror that the cabin itself was shaping these experiences, using light, air, sound, and memory to communicate, to remind, to haunt. I retreated from the trapdoor, moving to the center of the main room. The flashlight revealed a circle of scratches in the floorboards, deep grooves forming almost geometric patterns. I knelt, brushing dust aside, and realized they were layered, older markings beneath newer ones, spanning decades. Each visitor, each inhabitant, each observer had left their mark. I traced a finger along the lines and felt a pressure, a resistance, as if the cabin itself recognized my presence. I could feel the stories of those long gone pressing through me, their fear and awe becoming my own. The cabin was a record, a chronicle, a living memory, and I had become part of it. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement again. A figure, barely visible, standing in the doorway leading to the loft. It tilted its head, motionless yet deliberate, and then vanished as quickly as it appeared. My pulse raced. I whispered aloud, calling its name, but there was no response. Only the dragging sound resuming softly, pacing around me. I realized that I was not alone in the cabin in any conventional sense. Something remained, something patient, observing, interacting with me in ways I could feel but not see. And the realization sank in fully. The cabin had been waiting for me. For over a century, it had waited for someone to arrive and carry forward its story, to participate in its memory, to become part of the living record that it maintained. I sank to the floor, flashlight trembling in my hands, trying to comprehend what I had experienced. Every creak, every whisper, every shadow now had meaning. The dragging sound continued, a rhythm that was at once alien and familiar, circling me, measuring me, testing me. I traced the scratches in the floor again, noting patterns, repetitions, signs of human and something else intertwined. Each moment reinforced the presence that filled the cabin, not visible, not fully tangible, but undeniable. My body shook, my mind raced, yet I remained, compelled to witness, compelled to record, compelled to understand. The historical accounts returned to my mind, fragments pieced together from old newspapers and oral histories. Farmers, hunters, wanderers, all spoke of the same experiences, being watched, hearing noises with no source, seeing shadows move in impossible ways, and returning changed, some unable to speak, others pale and haunted for life. Each account confirmed what I now knew firsthand. The cabin was a repository, a witness, a living memory that reached out across decades, across generations, to mark all who entered its domain. And I was no longer merely an observer. I was part of its history, one more name to be whispered among the mountain men, one more presence recorded in the air, in the floorboards, in the walls. I stood slowly, the weight of centuries pressing on me, the shadows pooling around me like water, alive and shifting. The dragging sound had stopped. Silence reigned. Yet the awareness remained, the sense that the cabin had not finished with me, that my presence had been noted and catalogued, recorded into its memory. I stayed in the center of the cabin, heart pounding, the flashlight trembling in my hands. Shadows pooled unnaturally along the walls, stretching and bending like liquid ink. I knew I had to see it, whatever it was, but dread weighed heavily against my curiosity. A sudden scraping sound echoed from the far corner, deliberate and slow, as if measuring my attention. I swung the flashlight toward it, and for a brief moment I saw a shape. Thin, hunched, impossible. It moved with unnatural fluidity, almost gliding across the floor. I blinked, and it vanished. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with memory. Every creak of the floorboard, every whisper of wind through the cracks, seemed amplified, deliberate. I approached the kitchen area, where a long-forgotten table lay overturned. On it were remnants of objects, rusted utensils, a broken cup, something that looked like a fragment of cloth, preserved unnaturally in the dust. And then I saw scratches along the tabletop, fresh, as if made by fingernails only moments before. The dragging sound began again, circling the room, sinking to my own steps. My pulse raced, every muscle tensing in anticipation. I dared to speak, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" The cabin responded in its own way. A faint scraping from above, followed by a low, almost inaudible sigh. My flashlight flickered, and in that instant I saw them. Figures, not fully formed, shadows layered upon shadows, standing silently in corners, moving imperceptibly when I wasn't looking directly at them. They did not walk, they did not breathe. They simply existed, as if the memory of past visitors had coalesced into something alive. My mind struggled to comprehend, to rationalize, but nothing explained it. This was not imagination. This was the cabin asserting its presence. I retreated toward the loft ladder, compelled to climb again, despite the fear twisting in my gut. Each step revealed new marks, scratches in the beams, cryptic symbols, faint outlines in dust, evidence of centuries of observation. At the top, the loft seemed transformed. Objects I had seen earlier were now displaced, rearranged into patterns that made no logical sense, almost ritualistic. And then I saw it. A small chest in the corner, one I hadn't noticed before. Its lid was ajar, revealing a collection of journals and papers, each one yellowed and brittle, yet somehow intact. I reached for them, and a cold wind swept through the loft, extinguishing my flashlight for a moment, leaving me in complete darkness. When the light returned, the chest was empty. I stared in disbelief. Nothing had moved visibly, yet I knew with certainty that something had interacted with it. The dragging sound resumed, circling me now, faster, deliberate, a rhythm that matched my pulse. I could feel presence on all sides, close enough to brush against my consciousness, yet nothing visible. The cabin's memory had intensified, encompassing me, entwining me with all who had come before. It was a living archive, recording my every breath, my every thought, embedding them into its walls, its floor, its air. I descended slowly, every creak of the ladder echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The main room stretched before me, shadows pooling in corners and behind furniture. I shone the flashlight across the floorboards and froze. A circle of scratches had formed overnight, or perhaps while I wasn't looking. The markings were precise, deliberate, forming a pattern that seemed both human and alien. My finger hovered over it, hesitant, and as soon as I touched it, a cold shock ran through my body. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by silence, so intense I could hear my own heartbeat reverberate in the cabin. I looked toward the loft ladder. A figure stood there, not fully visible, more shadow than form, tilting its head as if observing. My voice caught in my throat. I whispered, I'm leaving. The figure remained, unmoving. I understood then that leaving did not mean escaping. The cabin did not release you. It remembered, and once remembered, it carried you forever in its presence. My steps toward the door felt heavier than they should have, as if some invisible weight pressed against my chest. The doorway loomed ahead. The dragging sound resumed, now behind me, pacing in step with my retreat. I crossed the threshold and felt a sudden change in the air, the cabin's presence receding slightly, yet leaving an imprint. I glanced back. The windows, shattered and cracked, reflected not just the moonlight but subtle shapes moving inside, figures I could not identify. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the cabin seemed to breathe, walls pulsing faintly, shadows stretching toward me like hands. I swallowed hard and stepped away, my boots crunching on the mossy forest floor, the dragging sound fading yet lingering in my mind. Outside, the forest was quiet, too quiet, the mist curling around the trees like smoke. I looked back at the cabin, its dark silhouette framed by the pale moon, and felt a shiver run down my spine. I knew that what I had experienced was real. The cabin had remembered me, and I had become part of its history. It was a living memory, patient and watchful, chronicling every visitor, every breath, every heartbeat. And I understood that anyone who enters carries its memory with them, forever altered, haunted by what cannot be seen but always felt. Even now, miles away, the memory lingers. I hear faint sounds at night, subtle and impossible to trace, the dragging, the whispers, shadows that move in peripheral vision. Friends ask why I cannot let it go, why I cannot stop recounting what happened. But the cabin is alive in me, in my mind, in my nerves. It is patient. It is eternal. It waits for the next visitor to carry forward the story, to become another mark in its memory. And I know that when I close my eyes, the shadows in that cabin do not sleep, they do not rest, and they never forget. Would you enter if you knew what awaited you? Could you step beyond the threshold, knowing that your presence might be recorded forever? The cabin in the mountains, abandoned since 1899, stands quietly, deceptively still. But its silence is alive, listening, remembering, waiting. And though I am far from it now, I am never truly gone. Subscribe for more chilling videos like this.